1945. Canadian tanks attacked Germany's last line of defense west of the Rhine River.
This was one of the heaviest battles on the Western Front during the Second World War.
The Germans are outnumbered and desperate, determined to defend the fatherland at any cost.
I'd rather take a few more enemies with me to the grave. That's what they were saying.
They lure the Canadians into a trap, and the armored advance turns into a fight for survival.
Every move that you make, they can see it, and it was just like shooting fish in a rainbow.
At stake is nothing less than the fate of Germany, as these two forces fight for control of a patch of farmland, simply known as the Hochwald Gap.
All you knew is that you had to kill them.
The Rhineland, fertile farm country in western Germany. Today, it's peaceful and serene. But in the winter of 1945, it's the scene of one of the most ferocious and costly battles of the Second World War. February 1945, the Second World War in Europe enters its final months. Allied armor rolls into the German Rhineland, and leading the attack is the 1st Canadian Army. Their objective, the Rhine River, and on the other side, central Germany. The Canadian mission is to hook up with British forces and push east, capturing bridges across the Rhine and the German town of Xanten. They've amassed a major strike force. 90,000 troops, 1,300 artillery pieces, and over 1,000 tanks. Their armored workhorse is the Sherman 5 tank. This 32-ton version of the Sherman has a short-barreled 75mm gun and only 51mm of frontal armor. That means less firepower and protection, but more maneuverability. And the Allies are able to produce thousands of them.
Well, the Sherman was a great little tank, and we had far more of them than the opposition had.
There was lots of them. That was one good thing. And the other thing was they were pretty rugged. They didn't require much maintenance. They were tough.
Weil der hatte so ein kurzes Rohr und
The Sherman had a short-barrel gun, so they could only damage us at a very close range.
der Sherman
The Sherman wasn't as good as our Panther.
Panther unterlegen.
He had a long cannon. They couldn't compare to the Panther.
So wie der Panther.
The Panther is armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun and is protected by 80mm of sloping frontal armor. And with a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour, the Panther is one of the best designed tanks of World War II. But in the winter of 1945, it's numbers that count, and the Germans are at a disadvantage.
The Allies had so much more equipment, so much better supply for gas, food, and ammunition.
Verpflegung, Munition. Da kam
We couldn't compete with that, and by 1945, we barely had any tanks
nach
left.
Weihnachten kaum noch Panzer.
To defend the Rhineland, all the Germans are able to field are a handful of Panthers, almost a dozen of the heavier Tigers, and less than 100 anti-tank guns. It's an enormous disparity in men and firepower. But the Germans have another weapon, sheer determination to stop the invasion of their homeland.
The day British and Canadian crossed the border to Germany, the Germans were defending their own country. Each of these soldiers thought not that he was fighting for Hitler or he was fighting for Hitler's regime, but he was fighting for his country, for his people at home.
It's called the fatherland, you know, in their terminology. So you're going to fight a hell of a lot harder than you would under normal circumstances. I was really amazed at the tenacity of it. It was just terrible, the resistance that they were putting up. You knew that they were going to be killed. They knew they were going to be killed, and they fought on anyway.
For many of our men, their homes had been destroyed.
Durch die Bombardierungen. Und die haben gesagt,
And they told themselves, what am I supposed to do at home? I'd rather take a few more enemies with me to the grave. That's what they were saying.
The Allied soldiers had to fight around every farm they saw, every little forest they saw, every little village they saw. They had to fight.
German resistance is ferocious, and as the battle enters its second bloody week, the assault bogs down. In 18 days of fighting, the Allies lose over 8,000 men and hundreds of tanks, while advancing only 25 kilometers. Allied command sends in Lieutenant General Guy Simmons, commander of the 2nd Canadian Corps, to get things moving. He implements Operation Blockbuster, a bold plan for tanks and infantry to attack quickly and at night, seizing the high ground between the villages of Kalkar and Udom. This will clear the way for his main force to cross a valley and overwhelm German defenders dug in along the Hochwald Ridge, their last line of defense before the Rhine River.
The Germans knew the terrain because it's their terrain. Yeah? And so it wasn't so important that they only had 10% of the army of the Allied. It is very easy to hide soldiers in these forests. It's very easy to hold up every soldier who's coming, every tank who's coming. And this made it very difficult to take this ridge and the movement.
But this is just the beginning of the Allies' problems. They also have to deal with the weather, and spring has come early to the Rhineland.
Da waren 3 Flüsse.
Because of the melting ice, 3 of the rivers were carrying so much water. We also destroyed the dams. And there were 2 other rivers that were carrying so much water, there was no way for them to get through. And there was also a lot of mud.
It flowed over all the roads, all the fences, and your maps became useless because all you could see was endless mud.
Da waren auch rechts und links.
To the left and right of the roads, the ground had turned to swamp, so they had to stay on the roads. They couldn't use the fields. And there, they were easy targets for us.
In the early morning of February 26th, Canadian infantry, supported by nearly 80 tanks of the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, launched Phase 1 of Operation Blockbuster. Their mission is to take and hold the German-occupied Kalkar Ridge, clearing the way for the main attack against the Hochwald on the other side of the valley. It begins with an artillery barrage by 700 Allied guns.
All those guns broke loose, just tremendous fire. The sound of the gunfire and the tremendous volume of it as we were advancing, our own gunfire, it was a sound that was so great, you could feel it on your body. This constant roar, even inside of the tank, you could feel the guns. They make a little more noise when you're in front of them than they do when you're behind them. It was raining very steadily. The ground was just terrible, absolutely terrible. We pressed into the minefields, and the first 3 tanks hit mines. artillery mine would blow your track off, and it would buckle the floor under the driver. And that basically disabled the tank. We reported that we'd hit the minefield, and the 2 IC came on the air and said, "Press on." And I can recall Butler said, "How the hell do you press on when you're in a minefield?" And this is in the dark. You really don't know what the hell you're doing. And we found sort of a little track or trail. And we turned right and went through the minefield basically on a country lane. So the Germans hadn't minded. The loader operator's job really is, like if they're not firing immediately, is to pivot your periscope. And as we progressed, I could see 2 German tanks off as they passed a burning barn. And I yelled into the mic, "German tanks."
They're Panthers, and they're easily able to outgun Hale's short-barreled Sherman.
You knew you can't do anything about it, particularly at a distance.
But the Canadians have some additional firepower. Each troop of 4 tanks includes at least 1 Sherman Firefly, armed with a long-barrel, high-velocity cannon. It's a tank buster, the so-called 17-pounder, able to penetrate 130 millimeters of armor at ranges of almost 1,000 meters.
But the long-barreled 17, you let him go in. You're not going to bother using a 75 against the front view of a German Panther.
The first shot from the 17-pounder hits a barn, and the Panthers retreat in the smoke and confusion.
Typical German tactics. You have the tanks in front maybe, and as soon as the attack comes in, they fire, and then they back away and draw you under their anti-tank guns.
Despite the danger, Hale and his squadron push on to the ridge.
We got to the top of the Calcar Ridge itself, and then all of a sudden, wham, it was daylight.
John Hale and fellow tankers of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers have entered the killing zone. If the Canadians fail to take Calcar Ridge, Operation Blockbuster and the Allies' big push to the Rhine will be over before it really begins. February 26, 1945. Operation Blockbuster is underway. And the fighting is furious from the very first shots. Lieutenant General Guy Simmons sends scores of Sherman tanks into the thick of it. Their mission is to take and hold the heavily defended Calcar Ridge, clearing the way for the main attack aimed at driving the Germans back across the Rhine River. But even though they're outnumbered, the Germans stubbornly stand their ground.
We got to the top of the ridge, and then all of a sudden, wham, it was daylight, and the Germans were shooting. They were being fired on from our left flank and in front. And I can remember particularly this barn on our left flank. And the doors were coming open. And we were yelling at the gunner, the doors are opening.
What Hale has spotted is the infamous 88, Germany's most powerful anti-tank weapon. The 88s fire armor-piercing shells, able to penetrate almost 100 millimeters of steel at distances up to 1,500 meters, and the Canadians are well within range.
I don't know about you or anyone else who's ever looked down the barrel of an 88. When it fires, you can actually see it coming at you. It's like a rolling ball, like a fist coming. You can see the sparks coming off of it. It passed over our tank and cut off the aerial within a foot of the tank behind us. Then we instantly fired just as soon as he had fired at us. Looking behind us, the Grenadier Guard tank that was liaison, his tank got hit. There's an immediate fusion of the metal into a cherry red glow where it's hit with a black hole in the middle of it. And the crew commander was coming out the hatch, and the ammunition exploded, and he just sort of threw up his arms and then collapsed down into the turret. There were still 6 of us left on the top, and we were all firing forward and to the left flank. And the Germans started cutting down the farmhouse structure. They were ripping it down, and we were using it for cover. We were pulling out and shooting and so on. We couldn't withstand the amount of fire that was coming at us. We were going to all get knocked out. The infantry had dug in and could defend their position. So we fired a smoke shell for 5 of the other tanks. One at a time, they pulled off the ridge as we blanked the left flank. By that time, the buildings were nearly gone and just burning rubble. And we decided to pull out. And the tank in the heavy mud, we put it in first gear and pulled ahead, but it sort of snuffled under and stopped. And a German shell fired right across in front of us. And then we started moving forward again, and then finally there was another shot came at us. And Butler was in the turret, and he was standing there, and he just sort of fell on the floor on his ass, and he said, "Oh." And it had a strange sound to it, you know, sort of, it didn't have the crack, it had a whir. And I said, "What happened to that?" He said, "You wouldn't believe it, but that was coming for us, and it hit a hydro pole." We started out with a squadron, and 19 tanks and 1 liaison tank, and we wound up with 6. And that's my first introduction to the Rhineland battle.
More tanks join the attack, and the battle goes on into the next day. Finally, the outnumbered and outgunned Germans are forced to fall back, and the Canadians take Calcar Ridge. With Calcar Ridge secure, armor from the South Alberta Regiment moves forward for the main attack against the next ridge. It lies across a muddy valley and will give this battle its name, Hochwald. General Simmons' plan is for infantry supported by the tanks of A Squadron to advance towards the village of Udon and seize the rail embankment, while B Squadron attacks across the valley into a long gap flanked on either side by thick woods. The aim is to force the Germans back to the village of Xanten on the Rhine River. It's a bold plan, and it's off to a bad start.
When the time came, we moved out. I can still remember driving along, or slithering along, it's more like it. It took hours to go a mile. It was just unbelievable and very frustrating.
They were up to the sponson in mud. And so there we were, supposed to start at 11:30 at night, and we didn't get there till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning because of getting stuck, running out of gas, so on. It was almost daylight by the time they got it started, and you're going into the worst possible situation. You try not to have armor go through draws or files, and here is a wood on both sides, loaded with firepower. And and we're leading into this absolute killing zone. To go into that gap the way we did, and it was just like shooting fish in a rain barrel.
The Canadian tanks were plowing through deep mud. We laid our gun on the leading tank, and by the time we were ready to fire, it had already been hit. And we swung our gun to another, but that too stopped. The third tank at which we aimed fired first. And the shell burst only yards in front of us. Quickly, we realigned our gun. The tank seemed to falter, and we fired.
We were just moving towards the position, and the incoming fire was such that you just could not exist there. To see these soldiers still trying to go forward and being hit is soul destroying.
While B Squadron takes a beating at the Hochwald Gap, A Squadron advances towards the rail embankment running through the village of Udom. It's the only piece of high ground in a sea of mud.
It was what they called a right hook to go around Udom and try and establish a front by the railway crossing. Supposedly the town looked pretty vacant, but all the time you don't take that for granted. Anything that moved, we were shooting it up. The terrain was terrible. It was a real effort to get to our objective. Then on top of it, we had the traps. If you fell into one of those, you were finished right there. And here we were coming out onto a dike area, and unknown to us, on either side of the dike were big, deep ditches. The way those tank ditches were designed, as you were coming around, you'd eventually lock on to one of those roads. That was a little piece of high ground from the mud, and so we probably chose to take that. And then when you get on it, then of course you can't get off it. And we just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column. And they were just waiting for us. You know, we were sitting ducks.
디지털 세상의 중심에 내가 있다. 디지털 타임스. 디지털 뉴스에서 디지털 시대 삶의 지혜까지 살아있는 디지털 정보. 디지털 타임스. In digital. Digital Times.
The countryside near the German town of Udom shows little sign today of the ferocious battle that took place here. But during the final months of the Second World War, this quiet place was a battlefield. February 27, 1945. Canadian Sherman tanks, avoiding minefields and mud, advance along a narrow dike, attempting to secure the railway embankment running through the town of Udom.
We just fell right in line. And that's the worst thing that could ever happen to an armored column, is to have your tanks one behind the other. The Germans had placed a lot of Tigers embedded down in the ground area, and anti-tank guns, and they were just waiting for us. Eddie, he was at the front, saw the Tiger. And I guess he knew that the Tiger was drawing a bead on him. Eddie loaded up an AP, and he shot that out. According to him, he says the shell just bounced right off its hide. And so he knew that he had to go to stage 2, which was get that opening.
The German Tiger is a 57-ton monster. It's built like a battleship, protected in places by more than 100 millimeters of steel plate. The Tiger seems indestructible, but it has a weak point. A narrow gap in its armor where the turret meets the hull. A shell strike there can put it out of action.
He did. He managed to jam the Tiger.
But it does no good. The Canadians are caught in a trap. The Germans have prepared a perfect ambush.
And it was just very fast. They just took out the front tank, they took out the back tank. They just took every other tank out. We were hit in the soft spot, like in the back. It was very abrupt, deafening, instant. Right off the bat, then you jump into action. You say, you got to get out. You know that baby is burning. She's brewing up. We were fortunate, managed to get out. Corporal McGivern looked and he saw the old girl was burning up pretty bad at the back end, so he says, we got to get out of here. And he looked over and he says, there's a farmhouse. He says, it's a short distance away. He says, we'll make a run for it.
They reach the farmhouse only to be captured. Trooper Gardner and his tank crew spend the final months of the war in a prison camp. They're the lucky ones. In the first 2 days of battle, hundreds of Canadian soldiers die, and hundreds more are wounded. Grim proof of the fierce defense put up by the Germans.
When you were there at the time, you didn't understand why they were fighting so hard. You didn't know why they were fighting. You didn't have time to understand what they were doing. All you knew is that they were fighting, and they weren't surrendering.
Each of these soldiers believed that each day they could hold their position, would help their country, because it was so close to the industrial center of the German Reich. Most of the war industry was there.
Die Armee hat gekämpft,
The army was fighting to prevent any enemy from entering the Fatherland. That's why we were fighting so hard.
Haben sie sehr stark gekämpft.
On the morning of February 28th, the Germans strike back at the Canadians' most vulnerable point, the Hochwald Gap. The Canadian tanks and infantry push into the gap and take ground near the western end. An advance force of Shermans moves forward to the midpoint in the gap. And the Germans pounce with Panther and Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns. Gunner David Marshall witnesses the attack.
Over the rise in front of us came the snout of 2 tanks, a Tiger and a Panther, heading our way. When our gunners had them in our sights, and before the German tanks could level out to bring their 88s down on us, our tanks opened fire, with all guns blazing. We stopped the attack, destroying the Panther and forcing the Tiger to retreat.
Germans strike again and again, and the Canadians struggle to hold their ground. But just when their situation seems desperate, help comes roaring in from the skies.
The weather started to get better, and the fighter bombers came firing rockets. The typhoons were dangerous for us.
The typhoons would range in above you, behind you somewhere, with 20mm cannons. When they're converging on the target, then he lets go his rockets. And it's just a hell of a noise, and all you see is pieces. It'll break a tiger or a panther, break them in pieces. So they're very helpful.
The Typhoons, or Tiffies as the tankers call them, stop the German advance with their rockets. But in battlefield chaos, anything can happen, as Canadian tanker Bill Luton recalls.
A sound was heard overhead unlike anything I ever experienced in battle. Something like the noise of a high-speed train passing through a tunnel. I paused in wonderment, and then heard an explosion. I looked up to see the Tiffy flaring away.
Luton and his crew are under attack by the deadliest tank killer on the battlefield. One of their own Typhoon fighter bombers. The Battle of the Hockwald Gap enters its third bloody day, and it's a standoff. The Germans won't back down, even though they're outnumbered and under attack by Allied warplanes. Rockets from Typhoon fighter bombers shred the Germans' dwindling supply of tanks.
They were dangerous, these Typhoons, attacking every tank.
The Typhoons swarm the Hockwald Gap, and in the chaos, one of them targets a Canadian tank.
A sound was heard overhead unlike anything I ever experienced in battle. I paused in wonderment, and then heard an explosion.
There's nothing Bill Luton and his tank crew can do but release canisters of yellow smoke to identify themselves as friendly.
Smoke blossomed gloriously on both sides of the tank, and just in time. But no, he kept coming and dove directly at us. I saw a great puff of smoke and instinctively ducked inside. A futile gesture against a rocket. Again came the sound of the express train in a tunnel, and again the explosion. We were still alive to hear it. The Tiffy had missed again.
The Typhoons attack all morning, blunting the German attack. At noon, Canadian tanks push forward in another attempt to clear the Hockwald Gap. But again, they are stopped by German tanks and artillery. That night, tanks from the Canadian Grenadier Guards try again. But the Germans have perfect aiming points on either side of the gap. Tracer rounds light up the sky, and the Guards are caught in a crossfire. By the time it's over, they have gained no ground and lost 10 tanks.
We had the numbers of troops, weapons, and so on our side. But a very well ensconced enemy on the approaches can make you pay dearly, no matter if you have the odds.
Dawn, March 1st. The battle enters its fourth day, and the Canadians are still only halfway through the Hockwald Gap. German tanks and anti-tank guns in the woods on either side of the gap will have to be taken out one by one. That means attacking with tanks through the trees.
Fighting through two forests is an absurdity, just an absolute absurdity. You should never do it. The biggest problem was the Panzerfaust, the was the one-shot rockets that they had.
Panzerfaust means tank fist. It's small, highly portable, and lethal. It fires a 140mm shaped charge at ranges of up to 60 meters and can penetrate 200mm of armor, tearing a hole through the tank and unleashing a devastating explosion inside.
He could hide in the wood. All he needed was an opening. He's got a big target, and once he hits that tank, there's a chance he sets off the ammunition in it, or starts the tank on fire, or he has wounded at least one or a couple of the crew.
They'll knock out a tank just like that, bingo. I don't think tanks are that useful, but that's what you had. We were going through with the Fusiliers Montreal into the forest in daytime. And 4 tanks were in line ahead, which is not very effective, instead of being spread out. The major of the Fusiliers Montreal wanted us to use HE against this group of Germans in a clearing that was in front of us, which was our objective.
The Sherman 5 carries 2 main types of ordnance: armor-piercing shells for use against tanks, and HE, or high-explosive rounds for softer targets.
You'd have to be careful and use the shock action more than the weapon. The ground shakes like an earthquake. But the Germans were protected. If you brought fire on them, they had overhead cover. And as soon as the shelling stopped, they're back into position, throw the sticks and what have you out of the way, and they're ready for business.
The field artillery observation officer, he called in a crumpet 25-pounders. And all of a sudden, they came in and they landed on that clearing. Just the most magnificent shooting, and they just plastered about 10 or 15 rounds right in front of us.
The heavy artillery clears the Germans, and the battle continues for the next 36 hours, with tanks and artillery making small gains against fierce German resistance. Then, on the morning of March 4th, the battlefield is silent. During the night, the Germans have fallen back, leaving the Hochwald Gap for the Canadians. The Shermans advance, and their objective, the village of Xanten on the Rhine River, comes into view. This is where the Germans will make their last stand. For the exhausted and battered Canadians, the fighting is far from over. The Hochwald Gap, a remote patch of farmland in western Germany. In February 1945, this was the scene of one of Canada's most brutal and costly battles of the Second World War. After 5 days of fighting, the battle comes to a swift and surprising end. German forces retreat in the night, leaving the gap and the woods on either side to the Canadians.
This is an art that the Germans have, and we should really basically learn by it, because they have a habit of putting on a tremendous show so that the last thing you can think of is they're withdrawing. But that's what they do, but they leave people in position who then are very aggressive with their weapons.
And they left 2 tanks, 2 Panthers. One was giving the other covering fire. one would sit there and poke at anybody who showed up on the top of the hill. The other guy who turned around and going like hell the other way. My buddy Ed was there, and Ed looked at the situation because he didn't put his tanks over the top. He kept them behind the crest, what they call sort of a turret down position, because they could kill you. They could put a shell in the front of a Sherman and it'll come out the back. And they could do it 3 miles away. And Ed looked at the situation and figured out, well, maybe I can get these both if I do it right. So he gave gunner control, and the gunner will drop the breech on his gun and look through the gun barrel and watch the gun crest clearance, and he gets his sight on the tank. When he's got crest clearance, then he fires. The dangerous one was the one that was facing him because it has the heavier plate in the front, and it has the gun in the front, which still could get him. In that first tank, he was backing up along a little narrow road with ditches on the side, and he accidentally backed the back corner over the ditch, and it tipped up the next plate. And it was just a flat plate, not very thick.
The 45-ton Panther has 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, making it almost impenetrable. But its underside is only 30 millimeters thick and very vulnerable.
He could see what was happening and studied the thing, and he hit a right bang in the middle of this plate. So he just kept firing. This tank brewed up, and I don't know if people get out or not. But the other one was going the other way. The gun was pointing away from him, and the back of a Panther tank is not thick. It's probably 3 inches. One round at on the other tank, and he ricocheted off the deck and took the commander's head off. Everybody hopped out of that one that could hop out, and that tank was left there.
With that, the last remaining obstacle in the Hochwald Gap is out of the way. And the Canadians push forward to the outskirts of Xanten, their final objective. This is where the Germans have set up their last line of defense. But it's just a matter of time before they are overwhelmed. Allied warplanes mount a series of heavy destructive bombing raids.
Every day, every night, there were bombings of the city. The city, which was before of that never attacked, now was destroyed by about 85%.
I remember the bombings very well. We had to go down to the cellar very often. We heard the alarm sometimes in the middle of the night, and we were really scared. It was terrible. We heard the ordnance rumbling and watched the planes dropping bombs. There was a lot of destruction. There were dead horses lying all around. This was a terrible experience for us.
On March 7th, a month after the fighting in the Rhineland began, and 8 days after their costly attack through the Hochwald, Canadian Sherman tanks roll into Xanten. They capture the bridges over the Rhine and open the way for an all-out Allied advance into the German heartland. Germany will surrender in less than 2 months.
This battle here in the Rhineland is one of the forgotten battles of World War II. It was the Canadian-British Army who opened the gate to Berlin.
In the end, the casualties on both sides are appalling. The Germans lose 40,000 killed and wounded. And for the Canadians, the fighting in the Rhineland, including the Battle of the Hockwall Gap, became their bloodiest campaign in the entire war.
The Rhineland, in terms of casualties, basically 5,300 dead and wounded in, shall we say, 30 days. Like, that surpasses D-Day, it surpasses the worst of the Scheldt.
Strange enough, there isn't a sense of elation. It's more, thank God it's over, because coming to mind is the people that have been lost, the price paid, and that this is not the end.